Environmental trade-offs, cleanup endpoints. How clean is clean? We've kind of touched on this throughout the week. I think, to me, and actually to a lot of people, I think, particularly when you're not in the middle of a response, these issues, when you ask questions about environmental trade-offs and cleanup endpoints, the answer is typically not very satisfying. Oftentimes you find yourself in answering, it depends. Where is the balance point between too much cleanup and too little cleanup? Well, it depends. What would be the where would be the cleanup endpoint for this particular type of shoreline in this type of scenario? Well, it really kind of depends. And hopefully, as we've kind of been working through this week, you've kind of gotten a sense of some of the complexities that people are faced with in trying to make these decisions. You've got oil, which in and of itself is a complex mixture. You've got it weathering over time based on the conditions that are out there. You've got different shoreline types that are going to have differing levels of sensitivity. You may have different resources on those shorelines. There might be a seasonality to those resources. There might be sensitive life stages sometimes of the year versus other times. So it's very difficult to pre-plan on this shoreline, this is what the trade-offs are going to be, and this is what the cleanup endpoints should be ahead of time. So it's really something that really has to be kind of defined at the time of a spill or during a spill. But it can take up a lot of discussion among the subject matter experts, and you really need to have some open-minded folks who understand the environmental issues, the operational issues, the chemistry issues, and so on and so forth. So a lot of that discussion happens in the environmental unit. So just kind of want to walk you through this little conceptual discussion because I'm not going to be able to stand up and say, for marshes, this is your trade-off, these are your trade-off issues in all cases, and these are the cleanup endpoints in all cases. But you need to be able to appreciate that there's a complexity in there that can really only be resolved during the time of the spill. So, with that in mind, this is what I'm going to talk about. Kind of step back a little bit and kind of ask the question of why we respond in the first place. How we go about responding, and talk about environmental trade-offs and how do you get closer to defining that balance point between too much cleanup or too little cleanup, and how you can kind of think about it, conceptualize it. And then when you're getting to that point, you're starting to get to the point of deciding, well, maybe that's where the cleanup endpoint should be. So we'll talk about cleanup endpoints, what they are, what considerations might be a part of that, and how do you kind of formalize that into the spill response process, the SCAP process, to make it, hopefully, so you can get from a it depends answer to a yes or no answer. And we'll get to this as we go through. So, to kind of step back and think about spill response. So let's say a ship grounds offshore, oil's released, and now you have to have a response. So what are some reasons why Coast Guard mounts a response? What are their sort of top three objectives? Coasties can't answer this question.
Maybe obviously it's part of their mandate, but maybe the spirit of that is to protect life and property.
Yep. So human health and safety is a big concern, right? What is this class about? Environmental protection. What's another big thing if you're talking about a spill that might affect marine traffic in San Francisco Bay? Economic impacts, right? Hey, look at that. So, protecting human health and safety, which would include not just the general public, but also responder safety. Obviously, responder safety is a big deal in responses, and will sometimes be a clearly justifiable reason why you wouldn't clean up a shoreline. Not just talking about the general area, but on the vessel itself, on the water, and on the shoreline might be different considerations, safety considerations for responders as well as the public. Minimizing environmental impacts, that's kind of what we're here for. So we're going to kind of focus on this for the purpose of this discussion, obviously, right? Because this is environmental response to oil spills. But we're trying to remember the goal of this element, this objective for the Coast Guard and other responders is to minimize overall environmental impacts. So it's not just impacts that result from the oil that's spilled into the environment, but also the impacts that the response might cause when trying to clean up that oil. So that you have to kind of think about both of those parts when trying to think through what an appropriate cleanup strategy might be. And I'm not going to touch on economic impacts, so really what we're talking about here. So, and you kind of think about how a response unfolds. One of the ways that I think about it is, you have the first initial slug of oil comes ashore, and you might be in like a gross removal phase where clearly oil is likely to be causing a lot more impact than the cleanup activities that you're likely to do on those shorelines, where your recovery of oil per unit effort is pretty high, where you're reducing the remobilization potential of a large portion of oil, those sorts of things. Then you may get to a point where you're not picking up as much oil on a per person effort basis, but there's still a lot of oil out there that might pose a risk. So you might get into more of an sort of a little bit more focused, active cleanup stage where there might be a lot more manual labor. There might be a lot more people on the shorelines, but they're trying to reduce that oil, the risk to those shorelines and those habitats based on the oil itself. But sometimes it's going to involve a lot of people, or a lot of equipment, a lot of time, and so on and so forth. So maybe there's starting to get to a point where you have to kind of be thinking about what the potential environmental trade-offs are of a situation like this. Then you may get to a point where you're not really, for all the people you're putting on the shorelines and the effort you're doing, you're not really picking up a lot of oil, but there's still some residual risk from that oil. And there may be still some types of efforts that you can do to help address that risk without putting a lot of people on the shoreline or disturbing a lot of critters. So you may move to sort of a passive cleanup stage where you put sorbent materials out there and you monitor those and pick those up periodically when they're picking up oil. Or you get into sort of a maintenance and monitoring phase where instead of having cleanup teams there every day, you have them go through a set of shorelines once a week or something and pick up stuff as they go to help kind of reduce that potential overall risk from the remaining residual oil that's in place. But the overall goal in all this is trying to minimize overall impacts, right? So in the context of spill response, some of the ways to minimize overall impacts is clear to have a rapid and effective response. If you can get to that gross oil cleanup quickly and effectively, then you can help to reduce the overall impact of the spill, hopefully. Deploy protection strategies, so you help keep oil out of places that might otherwise get oil. So that's something that you want to try to determine pretty quickly, and that's why Craig was talking about the resource at risk form, the resource at risk process in ICS 232 was to try to quickly identify those sensitive resources which can be adequately protected with the plans in place, so you can kind of help to minimize the overall impacts of that spill. Sometimes it may be appropriate to provide operations with constraints or best management practices of how to conduct their operations in a particular area to help manage the risks that the responders might impose on those habitats. And as we talked about throughout the week, is trying to get a better understanding of what the environmental trade-offs might be on a particular shoreline or a particular spill scenario, particular oil, so on and so forth. And that's going to really kind of hinge on things like the resource sensitivity, the timing of the spill during seasonality of different resources, the potential for re-oiling areas. Operational safety is clearly going to be a trade-off that's going to be needed to be considered in any spill response operation, and a lot of other considerations, which we've kind of touched on throughout the week. So that's kind of a bulletized way of thinking about it. Another way to think about it is sort of that state of health of a stable ecosystem, right? If we have time along the bottom here, I think people can easily conceive of how a healthy ecosystem, has sort of a steady state health status, and it might vary a little bit over time, but generally it's going to be fairly constant, right? So then let's say you have an oil spill that comes in, or some sort of other stressor that causes a fairly large decrease in the health status of that ecosystem, but hopefully a healthy ecosystem is resilient enough to be able to recover over some period of time. So that's this blue line, the no cleanup line. So then if you start thinking about how you might approach it as a spill responder or trying to clean up that type of impact to hopefully a somewhat healthy habitat, there may be different ways, different types of responses that may cause different types of curves of that habitat status over time, right? So you could come in with a fairly aggressive initial cleanup, such as cleanup number 1 here, that causes maybe some pretty significant impacts initially, but allows the habitat to recover more quickly over time. So maybe that's one potential way to clean up oil from an oil spill. Or you may go in with a less intrusive method, which doesn't cause nearly as much initial impacts, but also allows the habitat to recover more quickly over time than if you left the oil alone, right? Or you might choose to go in with a super invasive, type of operation that's not only going to get rid of the oil, but going to sterilize the whole shoreline, right? It's going to have huge amounts of initial impacts and may end up taking longer, causing the habitat to take much longer to recover than if you just left the oil in the first place. So it's trying to think about that recovery time, that nature has its own recovery time, and you as responders are trying to figure out a way to effectively shorten that overall recovery time while not causing too much impact in the short term. Does that make sense to folks? I think it's kind of largely common sense, but I think it's good to kind of step back from all the complexities, all the different types of science we've been talking about, and kind of say, okay, well, let's take a breather and think about how we would apply this to a spill. So you can kind of see how this discussion of this concept of understanding the environmental trade-offs and the complexities of the shoreline given a particular type of spill or situation can be important, right? And I think Mike Schomer mentioned this quote yesterday from a paper which some of our colleagues put together. I have a copy up here in front. I don't think I gave you a copy in your books, but this is available online at the IOSC website. You can download it for free if you want to read about this stuff. Where best cleanup strategy is not necessarily the one that removes the most oil, but the one that removes the oil that poses a greater threat than the cleanup activity itself. So it's kind of a written way of talking about this figure, essentially. So now that you've been in this class a little bit, you may see a picture like this, and maybe the question pops into your mind, is this the right type of cleanup strategy for the shoreline? Is this type of cleanup strategy more impacting of that shoreline and that recovery time of that shoreline than the oil was? And it may be that sometimes the answer is it depends until you actually really know what the nature of the situation is in that scenario, right? So maybe we're still at the it depends notion, but at least you're asking the question. It depends. What does it depend on? Let's talk about those things it depends on, and let's try to figure it out from there, which is a lot easier to do during a spill than before a spill. Or this type of situation, where is the risk? Is the risk an ecological risk because the oil is still tacky and rubs off on contact, or because there's pools of heavy oil in the spaces between the big boulders that can still be remobilized, or is still a potential ecological impact? Or is there a greater risk to the workers here that are trying to scramble over these rocks and try to focus on their work and not get injured? So maybe there's some trade-off considerations there that are really important to think through, because we don't want to be putting people at risk unnecessarily, obviously, especially in a situation like an oil spill. Or you can think about beaches. I think we've had a couple of people this week that have talked about how beaches can oftentimes be an easier place to pick up oil and a less sensitive habitat than other habitats. So there are times when, but your answer to a question of what are your environmental trade-offs, what are your cleanup endpoints, you may initially say, well, it depends. Maybe you can't get heavy equipment on that beach, so you're really kind of stuck with kind of a manual labor. Bring out armies of people and do some stuff. And you may be able to have an effective cleanup, but if there's certain endangered species that are nesting on that shoreline that time of year, maybe that disturbance is more impacting of that species or that habitat than leaving the oil in place. Particularly if the oil is really weathered and isn't tacky and doesn't really pose much of a contact risk or a toxicity risk because they don't feed on that type of item or that size item or something like that. So maybe there's some other things to think about. Or it may be that the very reason why you might choose to do an more invasive type of operation, like bringing in heavy equipment and doing digging operations, might be for the purpose of protecting a sensitive resource, like a threatened or endangered species. In this case, these pictures are from Costco Busan. In this case, this is Rodeo Lagoon, which some of you may be familiar with. It's kind of a long, skinny lagoon that kind of extends down the base of these hills. And the outlet to this lagoon kind of breaks through this beach berm on a seasonal basis, as the beach erodes away. The thing about that highly mobile shoreline is that in this case, in Costco Busan, there was a lens of oil that was buried under 12 or 15 feet of sand here. And when that channel breaks out to the open water, there's a possibility that that oil can end up migrating into the Rodeo Lagoon. But of course, there's a listed species in that Rodeo Lagoon, the tidewater goby. And so Fish and Wildlife Service, who is responsible for managing that resource, is very concerned about what the potential risk of the oil, the buried lens of oil here, might be to the tidewater goby once that beach starts to erode away like it does annually as part of natural processes. So that was one of the reasons that justified bringing in some heavy equipment and really kind of do a focused, rather invasive cleanup process that you might not necessarily do on other stretches of the shoreline because of other reasons. Okay. Also talked about marshes. Marshes are particularly sensitive to certainly to cleanup operations. Depending on the seasonality and the type of product and the water levels, they may or may not be particularly sensitive to the oil situation, the oil incident. One of the key things about the success and health of marshes is maintaining live plants, and a lot of that depends on their root structure, maintaining their root structure and the sediment that are in those marshes. If you put a lot of people in there, you're going to end up forcing a lot of that surface oil down into the sediment. You're going to end up breaking the root systems. That in and of itself may kill the plants and cause more impacts to those plants than the oil did. So you have to be very careful and understand the trade-offs consider them very carefully in a marsh situation. So it may be that you can only access the oil that's on the fringes of the marsh because that's how you can get there by boat and without having to put people on the substrate and potentially impact the root system and driving oil down into the roots. Or there may be channels that operations can work in and maybe do some level of cleanup if they have potential access. Or there may be areas where there's no real easy access for operations and the conditions are right to do an in-situ burn to try to remove a lot of, particularly the lighter end products that are collected in the pools and pockets. This is a picture of Chevron property after Hurricane Katrina, the big successful burn. And you look at some of our folks who are involved in that. They're doing some of the studies, some of the vegetation monitoring after that burn. They had plants resprouting, they were visibly resprouting within 5 days after this burn. Because the conditions, it was a well thought out plan, it was an effective burn, and the conditions were right to get rid of the oil effectively and still maintain the integrity of that habitat. And sometimes it's used as a management plan for certain types of wetlands as well, fire management. So a lot of times you find yourself in a situation responsive being faced with that question, is it clean enough? And the answer may be, until you start thinking about those trade-offs, is it depends. In this case, New Carissa, one of the big concerns there was plovers, nesting plovers. And so there has to be a discussion amongst the people that understand these things to understand the life history of the birds that are in the area. Are they likely to interact with this size tarball? Is that tarball weathered? Are they going to eat it? Are they going to touch it and bring it back to the nest and kill their eggs? If so, is that worth bringing equipment in there and people that potentially might disturb them off the nests? And it can be a difficult thing to think through, but these are the questions that need to be asked within the environmental unit to try to figure out where that balance point is of what's the appropriate cleanup operation and what, if any, constraints need to be placed on that cleanup operation to ensure that your overall environmental impacts from this spill are reduced. And sometimes, you may end up you may decide that let's pick up, every tar ball we see, until there are no more. But maybe you end up with huge amounts of solid waste, or they have to go to some hazmat landfill somewhere, which was certainly the case on Exxon Valdez, but is also certainly the case in other spills. The waste management can be a pretty significant issue for spills, and that's maybe a potential thing to consider as well. So thinking about these, where that right balance point is, would you agree that maybe there's some time, and recognizing that, like I think Josh said earlier, you can't pick up every drop of spilled oil. Some of it's going to weather and evaporate off, and so on and so forth. I guess you could, given enough time and money, but you may end up destroying the entire place. You might as well just pave the place over, right? So hopefully you get an appreciation that at some point you may reach a point where natural recovery might be an appropriate option to consider. Let nature take its course. Does that make sense? There might be times when you may have to leave, when it may be reasonable and defensible to leave some oil residue from that spill out there, because nature can do a better job of it than the response can to reduce overall impacts, right? So that may be the case in particularly sensitive environments like marshes. You may not be able to do a lot of cleanup in marshes because that cleanup is going to cause more impacts than the spill itself. Or it may be an issue of worker safety. If you can't get people safely on that shoreline, it's probably not worth no blood for oil. Is one of the quotes I read. And it may be that what your plan would be is to set up cleanup operations in coves on either side and wait for that stuff to get remobilized in a place where it's more easily accessible, which is sometimes why you may prefer it on a beach rather than a rocky headland, because it's easier to clean up on the beach, it's easier to access the beach, so on and so forth. Or there may be times in high energy environments, particularly where Mother Nature is going to do a better job of cleaning up that oil off a given piece of shoreline than you are. So maybe you want to try to recognize that and recognize that it's more likely that oil is going to remobilize off there. So maybe you want to have some strategy in place to collect that oil once it's remobilized, rather than try to clean it up off that shoreline. So, if you recognize that there may be appropriate times for natural recovery to take over, maybe we're getting to that point where you're kind of zeroing on a potential cleanup endpoints. Granted, it's kind of nebulous at this point because you need to kind of know what shoreline you're talking about in situations and so on and so forth. But at least conceptually, hopefully we're narrowing in on that balance point between too much cleanup or not enough cleanup. The folks at ITOP, the International Tanker Owner Pollution Federation in the UK, kind of looks at this, or states this problem by stating 3 questions to try to figure out, have you gotten to a point where maybe you should stop cleaning up? Is the remaining oil likely to damage environmentally sensitive resources? Does it interfere with the aesthetic appeal or amenity use of a particular shoreline? That may be a big deal on some high recreational use shorelines, for instance. Even if there isn't a lot of sensitive environmental resources, it's potentially huge economic resources. Is it detrimental to the economic resources or disrupting economic activities like ship traffic or shoreline facilities or something like that, or nuclear power plant intakes or something? So if the way that ITOP looks at this is, if the answer to any one of these questions is yes, then maybe there's still some level of cleanup that is still appropriate. If the answer to all these questions is no, maybe you've reached a point where it's better to stop doing some sort of response activity and let nature deal with the residual oil that's there. That makes sense? But to think through these questions, there's a lot of things you have to consider, and we kind of talked about that quite a bit this week, and we'll get into this. This will get you to if you can get to that point, then you're probably approaching the point of trying to determine and trying to articulate what the endpoint should be for a given shoreline. They should be clear and concise and measurable, because really what this is a goal for operations to try to achieve on a particular type of shoreline. So they need to know what their goal is, and it needs to be concise and simple to understand and be measurable so that you can kind of monitor that situation, monitor cleanup effectiveness as the spill goes on, as the response goes on, and kind of see how the cleanup operation is progressing towards that endpoint. Right, so it needs to be clear, concise, and measurable. You're going to have, because oil is going to interact with different shoreline types in different ways, it needs to be incident-specific shoreline and tied to the particular shoreline and oiling conditions. Oftentimes, cleanup endpoints in a spill response in oil spill are qualitative, generally qualitative in nature, because of the visually conspicuous nature of a lot of oil spills and the patchy distribution of oil spills. You're talking tar balls on a beach. You don't need to take an analytical sample of a tar ball to tell you that there's high concentrations of oil in that tar ball. If you take a sediment sample of an area that is surrounded by tar balls, but you take a sediment sample in an area where there isn't a tar ball, it may be below some parts per million threshold, but it's really that, it's the conspicuous tar balls that are the ones that are going to be posing the most risk, and so those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. So you don't necessarily, it doesn't really add very much to your knowledge base if you're taking a lot of analytical samples to try to determine what your cleanup endpoints are. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of cleanup endpoints are qualitative in nature, because if you see tar balls at a particular density and it's above this threshold, then pick them up. Don't rely on chemical analysis to try to figure out what the part per million level in that shoreline is, because it's probably not going to add anything to your, and it's going to be a huge amount of effort and a little bit of cost, and so on and so forth. Having kind of touched on this before about clear and concise measurable goals allows you to set up a systematic way to evaluate and kind of see how cleanup progress is being achieved. It's best to try to develop cleanup endpoints earlier in the spill rather than later, so operations really knows early on what their goals are, what the response's goals are overall, because that may help them kind of plan out and order stuff in time for logistics to be able to actually get the stuff that they need, and so on and so forth. And it may involve some, sort of periodic monitoring by SCAT teams, to kind of, as I said, kind of monitor cleanup effectiveness over time. All this discussion about cleanup endpoints is certainly going to involve considerations about the habitat and the oiling and the condition, what happened since the incident happened, and is the oil buried or not? Are there cultural resources in the area? If you have winter storms coming in, maybe you need to kind of think about some of those seasonal issues or weather issues. But don't forget that economic and political issues may actually play a role in some of those cleanup endpoints as well. Cleanup endpoints, to some degree, you try to base it on applying the knowledge and understanding and the science and technical issues that you know as responders. But to some degree, the cleanup endpoints may end up being a negotiated product. You're going to have key people at the table, and there may be reasons why, even though the background oiling rate is this, maybe it's appropriate to try to get it to this point and then see where we are and kind of move on from that. So there might be some political, economic considerations that need to be part of the conversation, but the overall conversation may be driven by some of these other resource or risk type issues. So who's involved in this discussion? Well, planning sections, environmental units, certainly. I mean, that's kind of what our group with this class is trying to focus on, is what types of issues are going to be considered by the environmental unit. So it would seem appropriate that we would talk about something the environmental unit would be involved in a class like this. Some representation from the SCAT program. Oftentimes it would be the SCAT coordinator, because those are your eyes in the field. They're going to have the best and most informed idea probably of what the condition of oil is and what the habitats are, maybe what some of the site trade-offs are, some of these other things that need to be considered. Natural resource trustees, because they're going to have a lot of technical information about the life histories and sensitive habitats and resource risk, and may help you kind of come up with creative ways of managing those spill-related risks or cleanup-related risks. It may be a matter of, if you have biological monitors in there, maybe you can clean up something to a higher degree of cleanliness without causing as much impact. to those resources. So, you know, they can provide some good input in those things. Land managers, because it's particularly, you know, public land managers like Park Service or sanctuaries or East Bay Regional Parks or county parks or something like that, because they're entrusted by the public to manage those lands. They may have particular management requirements imposed on them by federal or state or local laws that the response needs to be aware of when developing the cleanup endpoints. So it's important that they be involved in some of these discussions, and they also be involved in the final sign-off property because they're responsible for the properties they manage, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. And certainly you want to make sure that your cleanup endpoints are operationally relevant. It makes no use, it does you no good to come up with some pie-in-the-sky cleanup endpoint if operations can't feasibly get there. Some references that you can draw on to kind of think through this process or have these discussions are listed here. They're also listed, they're talked about in that IOSC paper I talked about. The shoreline assessment manual is something that's available on our webpage. It's something that would be part of a SCAT, like a 3-day SCAT training. I think Rainey's going to try to put that on a CD with a bunch of other references. You can also download it from our website if you want. The shoreline assessment job aid is something you guys have already seen. There's some discussion there about cleanup endpoints, environmental trade-off issues. There's other manuals that are available online. Environmental sensitivity index maps have some discussion about site considerations, shoreline considerations for different types of habitats, and what some cleanup endpoint discussion points might be. There may be some information in your area contingency plans, facility response plans, and certainly draw on local expertise, people that have been involved in spills in your area in the past, or even spills that have involved the same types of situations in other areas to help kind of prompt the discussion. So I think in the back of this section in your book, there's some examples in there, California examples, and you'll see that some of the, some examples of cleanup endpoints that are clear, concise, and measurable. Well, this may not be quite so measurable, but clear and concise, things like no visible oil. If there's no visible oil there, I'm not sure what type of operation you conceivably come up with to try to remove something you can't see. No more oil in the background. Some parts of California certainly have a natural background oiling rate. It doesn't make sense probably to try to clean up something cleaner than what natural background rate already is. No longer releases sheens that will affect wildlife sensitive resources, or no longer rubs off on contact. That's getting to the risk issues of, the oil may not supposed to be there, but if it doesn't pose a risk to wildlife or sensitive habitats, is it really worth it from a resource perspective to put a bunch of people in there to clean it up? So that can sometimes be a difficult endpoint to get to in discussion amongst people who aren't used to oil spill response, because sometimes people are people. There's someone made a mess here and it's their responsibility to clean it up. I don't care what that's impacting. I want that out of there. It's hard to get from there to something that's really kind of focuses on what the risk is that oil is really posing. If it doesn't posing a wildlife risk, do you really want to cause more risk to that wildlife by bringing in a cleanup operation? So maybe this is appropriate in some cases, or with some mixture of partners in the discussion. In the back of your book, you can't read it very well here, but you can probably read it better in the back of your book. There's some examples of shoreline cleanup endpoints for spills in California. This one is from up in Humboldt Bay. I can't hardly read it. But you can see how it's broken out by different shoreline types that were oiled during that incident. Marsh vegetation should be free of oil that can contact and contaminate wildlife, so on and so forth. So it's fairly clear, fairly concise, and somewhat measurable. All right, here's one from Sassoon Slough, which is the incident that Kathleen was just talking about. Water surface, mudflats and channel bottoms, marshes and wetlands. Those are the primary habitats that were involved, so there's cleanup endpoints for each of those, and you can read those in your book. Koski Busan had a pretty thick document that captured not only cleanup endpoints and trade-off issues. Here's a copy of the cleanup endpoints part of itself, but this 20-something page document was a document that came out of Costa Busan and talked about the SCAP process and how it was used, and the phasing of the cleanup, and the environmental trade-offs and cleanup endpoints for different types of shorelines, and the forms that were being used, including the sign-off forms. And so that's here as well. And of course, another more recent, sort of somewhat iconic spill, that whole thing down in Gulf of Mexico a couple years ago. There was a lot of discussions, technical discussions about, how do you evaluate the risk trade-offs or environmental trade-offs of the oil that might have to be left in place. Residual, the submerged oil mats that are sitting offshore. How much risk do those pose in place, and when might it be appropriate to go out and try to figure out a way to come up with an operation to clean up those submerged oil mats. So there was a lot of thought put into those and a lot of technical expertise. So there's a lot of examples out there that you can draw on to kind of help you through that process, or at least educate you and get you kind of build your intuition about what might be an appropriate, operationally relevant cleanup endpoints that help reduce the overall risk of the spill, both the oil and the cleanup. So once you have those cleanup endpoints, hopefully now you're more at a yes/no answer instead of a it depends answer, because you've used the specifics of the incident and the shorelines and the weather and the seasonality and so on and so forth to say, given these conditions, this is an operationally relevant cleanup endpoint for this situation, in these conditions. Does it meet that endpoint or not? Yes or no question. So you've gotten from it depends to yes or no, hopefully. That's what a lot of that discussion in the environmental unit hopefully is getting into. You kind of have that SCAP monitoring for effectiveness process. So this is kind of, it becomes this whole cleanup endpoint and sign-off process, might be kind of iterative to some extent, depending on what the issues might be. The sign-off team is going to be very closely related to SCAP teams. Some of your groups might have talked about it out in the field. Usually on the final sign-off, it's going to involve either the property owner or the land management agency that's responsible for that property to make sure they understand the trade-offs on that site, the degree of oiling, what was done to clean it up, what the cleanup endpoints were, and how it now relates to those cleanup endpoints, and are there any remaining issues. And clearly the sign-off, because of the nature of this discussion, the sign-off procedures may be instance-specific and habitat-specific as well. So at the point where you're signing off, you're trying to basically achieve this. The cleanup endpoint should help you clearly define if you would continue cleaning up or not. You may feel it's important to continue cleaning up if more cleanup is going to reduce the overall oil impacts or help speed up that habitat's recovery over time. But it should cease if doing additional cleanup isn't going to get you anywhere, or if it's not going to do any more than natural recovery would, or it would slow the eventual recovery of that shoreline. So hopefully you're getting, your final sign-off form is going to be, like I said, a yes or no question, hopefully, where it's either no further cleanup required or more cleanup required, and opportunities for folks to make comments about if more cleanup, then what that cleanup should be like, or what the land manager's considerations might be, if that shoreline is signed off. And signing off, as I think I might have mentioned the other day, doesn't necessarily mean that the RP is completely off hook for that shoreline. If there's always going to be a sort of a callback provision in the response where if that RP's oil is found in that shoreline and it's above cleanup levels, even after the segment has been signed off, then they'll be responsible for cleaning up that shoreline, continuing cleanup. So it may be that a signed off segment might get reactivated at some point. But at this point, on the best available information, the folks in the field on a final sign-off team should be able to answer yes or no, and ideally the answer would be no further cleanup is required. This is from Costco Busan, and you can see right there, yes or no. So hopefully you've been able to get from a it depends to a yes or no. So site-specific, incident-specific, the 3 questions.
Hopefully have people that are experienced and have the technical background to have a good and open-minded discussion, frank discussion about these types of issues. Because that's going to get you in, better cleanup endpoints and better understanding of the overall environmental trade-off issues. Like many things in the response, it's a matter of trying to achieve consensus and get agreement around the table about what the appropriate answer is, whether it's on SCAT team or that kind of things. Monitor and evaluate and incorporate them early on in the response and make sure that the SCAT program is involved in that, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be monitoring those shoreline segments against those endpoints.